The wind was a constant thief in this part of Wyoming, stealing warmth from a man's bones and reason from his mind. It tore across the plains with a lonesome howl, a sound Eli Carter had come to know better than any human voice, under a sky the color of old pewter. He worked, his movements stiff and deliberate. He was mending the corral fence where the last storm had ripped through, a squall that had come out of the north with the fury of a cornered animal. Each pull of the wire against the new post sent a jarring ache up his arms, but the pain was familiar, a dull companion in a world that had grown unervingly quiet. His hands, gloved and leather worn thin as paper, were calloused and scarred, a map of a life spent wrestling with the land. His face, weathered by sun and worry, was a mask of grim resolve. The lines around his eyes were etched deep, not from laughter, but from squinting into the relentless sun and the future, both of which offered little comfort. It had been 4 months since the world had tilted on its axis, since silence had settled over this ranch like a shroud, and Eli was still trying to find his footing on unsteady ground. He did not know how. He only knew the work. The work was honest. It did not lie, and it did not judge. It simply demanded everything a man had to give. And today, like every day, he gave it. When a last post was secure, he straightened his back, the protest from his spine a low groan. He wiped a sleeve across his brow, his gaze drifting past the barn to the small rise beyond. 3 wooden crosses stood there, stark against the gray horizon. 2 were new, their raw pines still pale against the weathered earth. The third, his father's, was old and silvered by time. He walked toward them, his boots sinking into the damp soil. The wind picked up, whipping his worn coat around him and whistling a mournful tune through the prairie grass. He had found a single stubborn wildflower that morning, a splash of defiant purple growing in the lee of a rock. He knelt now, his knee cracking in the cold, and gently pushed its stem into the mounded dirt of his brother's grave. Beside it was Sarah's, John and Sarah Carter. Gone. The word was a stone in his gut. He remembered the argument. The last one. The words had been sharp, thrown like knives in the heat of frustration over a failing crop and mounting debt. John had been reckless, always chasing a dream just over the next hill. Eli had been the anchor, the sensible one, and his words had been heavy with that sensibility. Go, he had told him. Go on your fool's errand if you must. He had not said goodbye. John had ridden out angry, his back stiff with pride. He never rode back. The official word was an accident, a spooked horse, a bad fall. But guilt was a stubborn creature, and it whispered to Eli in the lonely hours that his anger had been the ghost that spooked the horse. He laid a hand on the rough wood of the cross, his throat tight. I'm trying, John, he murmured. The words snatched away by the wind. I'm trying, but the words fell hollow. A poor offering to the ghosts that haunted this land. He did not know what else to say. He was not a man for words. He was a man for fences and fields, for the simple, brutal logic of survival. Love and grief were foreign languages he had never learned to speak. He pushed himself to his feet and turned back toward the cabin. Its windows stared out at him like vacant eyes. Inside, he knew 2 smaller ghosts were waiting, their silence as heavy as his own. The air in the cabin was cold and smelled of wood smoke and sorrow. A fire struggled in the hearth, its flames weak and sputtering, offering little more than a flicker of light against the gathering gloom. Luke sat on the floor, whittling a piece of wood with a seriousness that did not belong on the face of a 9-year-old boy. His shoulders were hunched, a small soldier guarding a fort of grief. Across from him, huddled in a blanket that swallowed her small frame, was Annie. At 6 o'clock, she seemed to have shrunk since her parents' passing, her eyes wide and dark in her pale face. They were watching the door, as they always were, waiting for him. Eli stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him. The children flinched. He closed the door gently, the sound of the latch clicking into place, echoing in the stillness. He took off his hat and hung it on a peg, his movement slow, as if he were an intruder in his own home. It is cold, he said. His voice came out rough, a rusty hinge that had not been used enough. He cleared his throat. Are you hungry? Luke shrugged, not looking up from his whittling. A small, perfect bird was beginning to take shape under his knife. Annie just shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter around her chin. Eli's hands felt large and clumsy. He did not know what to do with them. He had never known how to be gentle. His life had been about force, about breaking horses and plowing hard earth. Tenderness was a delicate, fragile thing, and he was afraid he would shatter it just by trying to hold it. He went to the hearth and added a log to the fire. The flames leaped up for a moment, illuminating the children's frightened faces before settling back into a sullen glow. I will make some stew, he said, more to himself than to them. He moved to the small pantry. The shelves were nearly bare. A handful of potatoes, a few onions, a half slab of bacon. Not enough, never enough. The ranch was failing, just as it had been under John. The land was unforgiving, and the debts were a hungry wolf at the door. He felt a familiar surge of frustration, hot and bitter in his chest. He was failing them. Failing John. He turned back to the children, forcing the words out. It will be all right. It was a lie, and they all knew it. The silence that answered him was his penance. The next afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was Reverend Miller, the town preacher, a man whose piety was matched only by the roundness of his belly. He stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of soap and self-satisfaction. "Eli," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I was just passing by. Thought I would see how you and the little ones are faring." His eyes swept the sparse cabin, taking in the cold hearth, the clean but worn floorboards, the two silent children who watched him with weary eyes. His gaze was full of a pity that felt like a slap. Eli stood stiffly by the table. "We are faring." The preacher smiled, a small tight motion of his lips. "It is a heavy burden, son, raising two children alone. The good Lord works in mysterious ways, but he does not expect a man to carry the world on his shoulders." Eli's jaw tightened. "I can manage my own affairs." "Reverend, of course," the preacher said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "But the town is concerned. The women of the church guild, they were speaking of it just this Sunday. They believe a woman's touch is needed in this house. A housekeeper perhaps, or a governess for the children's schooling. Someone to bring a bit of order and warmth." The suggestion hung in the air, thick with unspoken judgment. Pity. He did not want it. He would not have it. This was his family, his responsibility, his failure to bear. "I do not need anyone's pity, and I do not need a hired woman to raise my brother's children. We will make do." The Reverend's smile faltered. He looked from Eli's hard face to the children who seemed to have grown even smaller in his presence. "Pride is a sin. Eli, there is no shame in accepting help, and there is no honor in being a charity case." Eli shot back, his voice low and dangerous. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend. We'll be fine." The dismissal was clear. The preacher lingered for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for another verse to quote, before finally giving a small defeated sigh. He placed a Bible on the edge of the table. "The Lord is your shepherd. Eli, do not forget that." Then he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of his soap and the heavy weight of his judgment. Eli stared at the Bible, a black, unforgiving block on his rough-hewn table. He wanted to throw it into the fire. Instead, he turned away, the anger coiling in his stomach like a snake. That evening, the first flakes of snow began to fall, fat and wet and silent. They clung to the window panes, blurring the world outside into a soft, gray nothingness. Eli had returned from a hunting trip empty-handed. The deer were scarce, driven to lower ground by the coming cold. His failure gnawed at him. He sliced the last of the bacon and fried it with the remaining potatoes and onions. It was a meager supper, not nearly enough to fill 3 empty bellies. He gave the largest portions to the children, watching as they ate in their usual, unnerving silence. He ate his own small share, standing by the stove, the plate warm in his hands. When they were finished, Luke took the plates to the wash basin. Annie went to the window, pressing her small hand against the cold glass, watching the snow. "It is pretty," she whispered, her breath fogging the pain. Eli looked at her, a pang of something sharp and painful twisting in his chest. She was so small, so fragile. He should be able to give her more than this. A warm bed, a full belly, a life without fear. "Time for bed," he said gruffly. Luke helped his sister in her nightgown, his movements gentle and practiced. They climbed into the small loft bed they shared, pulling the patchwork quilt up to their chins. Eli stood at the bottom of the ladder, feeling useless. He did not know how to tuck them in, how to tell them a story, how to chase away the nightmares he knew must be waiting for them in the dark. "Good night," he said to the shadows in the loft. A small voice came back. "Good night, Uncle Eli." He waited until their breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep before he sat down at the table. The cabin was silent now, save for the whisper of the snow against the roof and the sigh of the wind. The loneliness was a physical presence in the room, a fourth person sitting at the table with him. It was a cold, suffocating thing pressing in from all sides. He rested his head in his hands, the rough calluses of his palms scraping against his stubbled cheeks. The weight of it all, the grief, the guilt, the fear settled on his shoulders, heavy and unyielding as a mountain. And outside the snow kept falling, burying the world in a silent blanket of white. The next morning, the world was white and clean, the snow muffling all sound. Eli hitched the wagon and drove into town for supplies. The town of Prairie Creek was not much more than a single dusty street lined with wooden storefronts, a place where secrets were currency and gossip was the most traded commodity. As he tied the horses to the hitching post outside the general store, he could feel the eyes on him. He could hear the whispers that stopped when he drew near, only to start up again the moment his back was turned. Inside, Martha Beasley, a woman whose face was permanently pinched in a state of disapproval, was holding court by the pickle barrel. All alone out there, she was saying to a small cluster of women, "It is not natural. That man is as wild as the land he works, raising those two poor orphans. It is a scandal is what it is." Another woman, Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, nodded vigorously. His brother John, God rest his soul, was always a bit touched by misfortune. It seems to run in the family. Cursed, some might say, that Eli has his brother's temper and none of his charm. Eli kept his face impassive as he walked past them to the counter, his shopping list in his hand. The storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, gave him a nervous glance. "Morning, Eli. Nasty bit of weather." "Morning," Eli said, his voice flat. "I need flour, salt, coffee." The women by the pickle barrel fell silent, their conversation dying in abrupt death. Eli could feel their stares burning into his back. He hated this town. He hated their prying eyes, their smug judgments, their whispers that followed him like stray dogs. He paid for his supplies, his movements clipped and efficient, and left without another word. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. At the far end of the store, near the bolts of calico and lace, a woman stood listening. Her name was Clara Bennett, and she was new to Prairie Creek. She had arrived 2 months ago from back east, a widow with quiet eyes and a gentle manner, to take up the post of the town's school teacher. She had heard the stories about the Carter family. Of course, small towns fed on such tragedies. She had heard about the accident, the orphans, and the reclusive, hard-bitten brother left to pick up the pieces. But as she listened to the women's cruel whispers, she felt not disdain, but a flicker of something else. Curiosity and a deep, aching sympathy. She knew something of loss. She knew how it could hollow a person out, leaving them brittle and sharp-edged. Her own husband, a kind and scholarly man, had been taken by a fever that had swept through their town in Pennsylvania, leaving her alone in a world that suddenly felt too large and too empty. She had come west, seeking not adventure, but peace, a place where she could mend the broken pieces of her own life in quiet service to others. She watched Eli Carter stride out of the store, his back straight, his shoulders squared against the weight of the world. She saw not the cursed, wild man the women described, but a man drowning in grief and struggling to stay afloat. And her heart, a thing she had thought too bruised to feel much of anything anymore, went out to him. That evening, as the sun bled a pale, watery orange across the snow-covered plains, Clara made a decision. She took the loaf of bread she had baked that morning, its crust a perfect golden brown, and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. She pulled on her warmest coat, wrapped a thick wool scarf around her neck, and stepped out into the biting cold. The walk to the Carter Ranch was over a mile, and the wind was a bitter, relentless foe. It pushed against her, stinging her cheeks and making her eyes water. The snow crunched under her boots. The only sound in the vast, silent landscape. More than one person would have called her a fool for walking out to the middle of nowhere, alone. As dusk settled, the women in the store certainly would have whispered about her impropriety. A widow calling on a single man at his home. But Clara was not thinking of gossip. She was thinking of 2 small children with hungry eyes and a man whose loneliness she could feel from a mile away. She saw the light from the cabin long before she reached it. A small solitary flame in the immense darkness. It looked terribly small, terribly vulnerable. When she finally reached the porch, her legs aching and her face numb with cold, she hesitated for a moment, her resolve wavering. What was she doing here? What if he sent her away? She took a deep breath, the cold air searing her lungs, and knocked. The silence that followed was long and heavy. She could hear movement inside, a chair scraping against the floor. Then the door creaked open a few inches. A man's face appeared in the sliver of light, shadowed and suspicious. It was Eli Carter. He was even more formidable up close, tall and broad-shouldered, his eyes a startlingly pale blue in his weathered face. They were guarded, weary eyes. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and unwelcoming. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She held out the bundle in her hands. "My name is Clara Bennett. I am a new school teacher. I baked too much bread today. I thought perhaps you and the children might like some." He stared at the bread as if it were a coiled snake. He looked at her, soaked in melting snow, her hair escaping from her scarf in damp tendrils, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. He was ready to refuse, to tell her he did not need her charity, to shut the door in her face and retreat back into his fortress of solitude. But then he saw her smile. It was not a pitying smile. It was small and soft and genuine, and in that moment, something in his hardened defenses cracked. He saw not an intruder, but a woman standing alone in the cold, offering a simple kindness. It was a sight so foreign, so unexpected, it disarmed him completely. Before he could find his voice, a small figure darted out from behind him. It was Annie. Her eyes were wide as she stared at Clara, then at the warm, fragrant bundle she held. "Bread," she whispered, the word full of a child's simple, profound longing. Just then, Luke appeared beside her, his face a mixture of suspicion and hope. Clara knelt down, ignoring Eli, ignoring the cold, and smiled at the children. "Hello," she said, her voice as warm as the loaf she carried. "I am Miss Bennet. And yes, this is bread. It is still warm." She unwrapped the linen, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the cold air. A smell of home, of comfort, of things Eli had long forgotten. Annie reached out a tentative hand and touched the crust. Clara laughed, a sound so clear and bright it seemed to push back the shadows in the cabin. "Would you like a piece?" Annie nodded, a slow, solemn motion. Luke's stern little face broke into a reluctant smile. And then, for the first time in months, the children ran. They ran to this stranger on their doorstep, drawn by the warmth of her smile and the promise of a full belly. Clara caught them laughing as their small bodies collided with hers, her warmth enveloping them, filling the quiet, lonely house with a sound it had not heard in a very long time. Eli stood frozen in the doorway, watching them. A storm of conflicting emotions raged inside him. Gratitude, sharp and unfamiliar, discomfort at this sudden intrusion of light into his darkness, fear of what this kindness might demand of him. He was a man adrift on a dark sea, and this woman had just thrown him a lifeline. He did not know if he had the strength to take it. She looked up at him over the children's heads, her eyes holding his. "May I come in?" she asked softly. "It is awfully cold out here." He hesitated for a long moment, the wind howling around the corners of the house, the warmth of the cabin behind him, the cold of the world in front of him. He looked at the faces of the children, illuminated by her smile, and he knew he could not send her away. He stepped back, holding the door open. "Come in," he said, his voice rough. "You can stay for supper." Eli woke before dawn, as he always did, to a cold and silent house. The habits of a lifetime were hard to break, even when the purpose behind them had grown thin. He dressed quietly in the dark, his movements economical, and went out to tend to the stock. The air was sharp and clean, the new snow muffling the world in a pristine quiet. For a few hours, there was only the work, the rhythmic pull of milking the one cow they had left, the scattering of grain for the chickens, the familiar smell of hay and horse. In the barn, with only the animals for company, he could almost forget the two small sleeping burdens in the cabin. He could almost feel like himself again. When the sun was a pale wash of light in the eastern sky, he returned to the house. His boots heavy with snow, he pushed the door open, expecting to be met with the same heavy silence as yesterday. Instead, he heard a sound that made him stop dead in his tracks. Laughter. It was thin and a little rusty, like a music box that had not been opened in a very long time. But it was unmistakably laughter. Annie's. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light by the front window where the morning sun cast a long, dusty beam across the floorboards. Sat Clara Bennet. She had a small tattered primer open on her lap. Annie was leaning against one side of her, Luke on the other. Clara was pointing to a letter on the page, her finger tracing its shape. "And this one makes the sound," she was saying, her voice soft and patient like in bread or boy. "B," Annie repeated, her small face serious with concentration. "Very good," Clara praised. "And what about this word here?" Luke squinted at the page. Boy. He read a flicker of pride on his face. "Excellent, Luke," Clara said. And then she looked at Annie and made a funny face, puffing out her cheeks. "Can you make a sound like a big buzzing bumblebee?" Annie giggled, a sound that was pure light. "Biz." Luke cracked a smile, a rare event that transformed his usually solemn face. He joined in, and for a moment, the cabin was filled with the sound of their buzzing and Clara's warm, encouraging laughter. Eli stood by the door, unseen, a ghost in his own home. He felt a strange and painful tightening in his chest. It had been so long since he had heard that sound. He had forgotten what it was like. He had forgotten that this house, a place that had become a tomb of memories, was capable of holding such a thing as joy. It felt foreign and dangerous, and yet he could not bring himself to move, to break the spell. Clara finally looked up and saw him standing there. The laughter died on her lips, and the children fell silent, their brief moment of happiness vanishing as they remembered their uncle's heavy presence. The familiar quiet rushed back in to fill the space. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Clara said, her voice a little uncertain. She had stayed the night, sleeping in a chair by the fire after he had gruffly insisted the blizzard was too thick for her to walk home. "The children and I were just passing the time." Eli nodded, his throat suddenly dry. He did not know what to say. "Thank you." Felt too intimate, too much of an admission of need. He walked to the stove and began to make coffee, his back to them. The storm has passed. The road to town should be clear enough. It was a dismissal, and he knew it. A part of him, the stubborn, prideful part, wanted her gone, wanted his solitude back. But as he heard her begin to gather her things, another quieter voice protested. He thought of the silence that would descend once she left. He thought of the fear that would creep back into the children's eyes. He turned, the coffee pot still in his hand. Clara was pulling on her coat, her expression carefully neutral. "They are very bright children, Mr. Carter," she said, avoiding his gaze. "They are hungry to learn. It is a shame for them to fall behind in their letters." She paused, then took a breath, as if steeling herself for his refusal. "If you would permit it, I could come back perhaps once or twice a week, only to help the little ones catch up. It would be no trouble at all." Eli looked from her earnest face to the two children who were watching him with a desperate, pleading hope in their eyes. He saw the way Annie's hand had unconsciously crept out to touch the fabric of Clara's skirt. He saw the flicker of life in Luke's face that had not been there yesterday. He was their uncle, their guardian. It was his duty to provide for them, and he was failing. He could not give them full bellies or a mother's comfort. But perhaps he could give them this small island of warmth in their cold, frightening new world. The word yes felt like a stone in his throat, a surrender. But he looked at his brother's children, and he could not deny them. He gave a short, sharp nod. "If you have the time," he mumbled, turning back to the stove. He did not see the brilliant smile that lit up Clara's face, but he felt its warmth across the room. Word of the school teacher's visits to the Carter Ranch spread through Prairie Creek faster than a prairie fire. It started in the general store, was nurtured in the church guild, and came to full bloom over sewing circles and back fences. A widowed woman alone, spending hours at a bachelor's homestead. It was improper. It was scandalous. "She says it is for the children's schooling." Martha Beasley sniffed to a rapt audience by the post office. "A likely story. She is setting her cap for him, is what she is doing. Thinks she can tame that wild man and get herself a piece of land in the bargain." Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, fanned herself, though the air was cool. "It is a disgrace. A woman of her station, a teacher, no less, should set a better example. She is practically living in his pocket. I call her the Cowboys Charity Project. She pies him, and he will take advantage of it." Clara felt the change immediately. It was in the way the other women would fall silent when she entered a room. It was in the cold shoulders she received at the store, the way mothers at the school would pull their children a little closer, their eyes full of suspicion. The whispers followed her, quiet but sharp, like the sting of a nettle. She was an outsider, and she had broken one of their unspoken rules. She had shown compassion to a man they had already judged and condemned. She tried to ignore it, to hold her head high and focus on her work. But the judgment wore on her, a constant low-grade fever of anxiety. It reminded her too much of the life she had left behind. She remembered the endless stream of visitors after her husband Thomas had died. They had come to her small, tidy house in Pennsylvania bearing casseroles and condolences, their faces etched with a suffocating pity. They had murmured about God's will and the frailty of life, but their eyes had said something else. They had looked at her, a young, healthy woman, and then thought of her brilliant, bookish husband now gone, and they had seen a tragedy that was somehow unfair, unbalanced. Whispers had followed her there. Too cursed luck. Poor Thomas. He never stood a chance. The town had wrapped her in a cocoon of their sorrow, and she had felt like she was suffocating. One afternoon, sitting alone in her small rented room above the Mercantile, she had looked out the window at the tidy gardens and white picket fences, and realized she could not breathe. She was drowning in their pity. Thomas was gone, her life with him, a quiet, gentle life filled with books and shared dreams, was over. She could either wither away here, a sad story for the town gossips to tell, or she could go somewhere new, somewhere the land was vast and the sky was wide, a place where no one knew her name or her history, a place where she could build a new life, not on the ashes of the old one, but on fresh, unbroken ground. And so she had packed her bags and come west, seeking not a husband or a fortune, but a chance to simply be Clara Bennett, school teacher. Nothing more, nothing less. and now it seemed she had traded one set of whispers for another. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Eli was fighting his own battles. A late frost killed a portion of his already meager winter wheat. The price of cattle had dropped, making it impossible to sell his few remaining head for anything that would make a dent in the debts John had left behind. Every day was a struggle, a relentless grind against a land that seemed determined to break him. The pressure built inside him, a hot, simmering anger that had no outlet. His temper, always close to the surface, grew shorter. He snapped at the children for small things, and then was consumed by a wave of guilt at the fear in their eyes. One evening he was trying to reset a shoe on his most stubborn mare. The horse was skittish, sensing his frustration. As he bent down, she kicked out, her hoof catching him squarely in the ribs. The force of the blow threw him against the wall of the stall, and he crumpled to the ground. The air knocked from his lungs, a blinding white-hot pain searing through his side. He must have passed out for a moment, because the next thing he knew, Clara was kneeling over him, her face pale with worry. She must have been just arriving for her evening lesson with the children. "Eli," she cried, using his first name for the first time. "Are you all right? Can you move?" He groaned, trying to push himself up, but the pain was a knife twisting in his side. "My ribs," he gasped. I think they're broken." Somehow, with her help, he managed to stagger back to the cabin. The children watched, their faces terrified. As Clara helped him into a chair by the fire, she sent Luke for the liniment and clean rags, her voice calm and steady, a beacon in the swirling chaos of pain. "Take off your shirt," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. He hesitated, a sudden awareness of her closeness, making him feel clumsy and exposed. But the pain was too great for pride. He fumbled with the buttons, his fingers clumsy, and she brushed his hands away, her own fingers deftly undoing them. She helped him peel the damp shirt off his shoulders. Her touch was light, professional, but it sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the pain. The skin on his side was already a mass of angry purple and black. She drew in a sharp breath. "We need to bind this," she said. She tore a clean sheet into long strips and began to wrap them tightly around his chest. He had to hold his arms up, and she had to lean in close to work. He could feel her breath on his skin, could smell the faint, clean scent of lavender that clung to her. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. In that small, quiet space, a tension arced between them, unspoken and powerful. It was an awareness of each other, not as a man and a woman, but as two lonely souls brought together by circumstance and pain. When she was finished, he sank back into the chair, exhausted and trembling slightly from the shock. She brought him a glass of water, her hand brushing his as he took it. He looked up at her, his defenses shattered by the pain. "I am failing," he said, the words torn from a place deep inside him. "I am failing them. I cannot save my brother, and I cannot save this ranch. It is all turning to dust in my hands." It was a confession he had never made to anyone, not even to himself. The words hung in the air, raw and bleeding. He expected her to offer platitudes, to tell him it was not his fault, to mouth the same empty comforts the preacher had. But Clara simply pulled up a stool and sat across from him, her gaze direct and unwavering. She did not speak. She just listened. She listened as the dam of his carefully constructed silence broke, and the words came pouring out. His guilt over the argument with John, his fear of losing the land, his crushing inadequacy in the face of raising two children who looked at him with their father's eyes. She did not judge. She did not pity. She simply sat with him in his pain, her quiet presence a balm to his wounded spirit. When he finally fell silent, his confession spent, she reached out and laid a gentle hand on his arm. "You are not failing, Eli," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You are surviving, and that is the bravest thing a person can do." In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred in the cabin's atmosphere. The children, seeing Clara as a source of comfort and stability, began to cling to her. Annie would run to her the moment she arrived, wrapping her arms around her legs and burying her face in her skirts. Luke, more reserved, would bring her his small wooden carvings, a bird, a horse, a wolf, holding them up for her approval, his eyes shining when she praised his skill. She had become the sun around which their small, broken world was beginning to revolve. Eli watched this transformation with a mixture of gratitude and stark fear. It was good to see them smile, to see the light return to their eyes. But their growing attachment to Clara felt like a precarious foundation. What happened when she left? The town's gossip was relentless, and she was a teacher with a position to maintain. She would not stay here forever in this failing house with this broken family. When she was gone, the silence would be even deeper, the loss even greater. Their hearts, just beginning to mend, would be shattered all over again, and his own heart. He refused to consider his own heart. His fears were compounded by a visit to town a week later. He went to the bank to speak with Mr. Gable about extending the loan on the ranch one more time.
Gable was a man whose heart was as cold and hard as the coins he counted. He sat behind his large oak desk, his fingers steepled, and listened to Eli's plea with a look of bored indifference. "Carter," he said when Eli had finished, "let's be frank. The land is over-leveraged. The soil is poor, and you have had 2 bad seasons in a row. Your brother was a dreamer, not a rancher. Continuing this is just throwing good money after bad. I just need more time," Eli said, his fists clenched at his sides. Until spring, Gable shook his head, a final dismissive gesture. "Time is not going to change the weather or the price of beef. I have a buyer, a consortium from back east, looking to purchase large tracts for a new cattle operation. They are offering a fair price, enough to clear your debts and leave you with a small amount to start over somewhere else. I suggest you take it. Sell the land before winter sets in for good, or I will have no choice but to foreclose." Eli walked out of the bank, the banker's words echoing in his ears. Sell the land, his father's land, John's land, the only home he had ever known. The thought was a bitter pill, a surrender he could not bear to swallow. That evening, as Clara prepared to leave, the weight of it all pressed down on him. She stood by the door, wrapping her scarf around her neck, the lantern she carried casting a warm, golden glow on her face. The children were already asleep in the loft, their bellies full of a stew she had helped prepare. The cabin felt warm, almost peaceful. It was a fragile, temporary peace, and he knew it. She smiled at him. "Your ribs are mending well," she said. "You are healing." He looked at her, at the kindness in her eyes, the quiet strength in her face. For weeks, she had been a steady light in his suffocating darkness. She had brought laughter back into his home, coaxed his brother's children out of their shells, and listened to his deepest fears without flinching. She had seen the broken parts of him, and she had not turned away. As she stepped out onto the porch and raised her lantern, he felt a sudden, desperate urge to ask her to stay, to tell her that he needed her. But the words would not come. He was a man who knew only how to push people away, how to stand alone against the storm. He watched her walk away from the cabin, the small circle of light from her lantern bobbing in the immense, encroaching darkness. He stood there until the light was just a tiny distant spark, and then until it vanished completely, swallowed by the night. He was alone again. The wind picked up, howling its lonesome song across the plains. But this time, the silence she left behind was different. It was not empty. It was filled with a memory of her presence, and it acted with a longing for her return. And in that moment, standing in the cold doorway of his failing home, Eli Carter realized with a sense of profound shock that her presence had stirred something within him he had thought long dead and buried with his brother. Hope. The storm came from the north, a great white beast breathing ice and fury. It did not arrive with a warning, but fell upon the plains in an instant, a wall of churning snow that erased the horizon and swallowed the sun. In her small room in town, Clara Bennett watched from the window as the world disappeared. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the glass in its frame, and the snow began to pile in great sloping drifts against the buildings. Town was shutting down, doors were bolted, shutters were drawn. It was a time for hunkering down, for staying close to the fire. But Clara's thoughts were not on her own safety. They were a mile out of town in a lonely cabin at the mercy of the elements. She pictured Eli still mending from his injury, trying to manage the ranch alone. She pictured Luke and Annie, their small faces pressed against a frosted window, watching the white monster devour their world. She had promised to visit them that evening for a lesson. The thought of them waiting for her, of them being alone in this, knotted her. She remembered the near-empty pantry, the constant worry in Eli's eyes. A storm like this was not just an inconvenience for them. It was a threat. She waited for an hour, then 2, praying for a lull that never came. The storm only intensified, its howl deepening into a menacing roar. Worry coiled in her stomach, tight and cold. It was a foolish idea, a reckless one. But she could not sit here safe and warm while they were out there. She made her decision. She bundled herself in every layer of wool she owned, pulling a thick shawl over her head and tying it fast beneath her chin. She packed a small satchel with a jar of beef broth, a block of cheese, and a small tin of salve. Then telling her concerned landlady she was just checking on a student's family, she stepped out into the maelstrom. The force of the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. It was like walking into a solid wall of ice and air. Snow sharp as sand blasted her face, and the cold was a physical pain sinking its teeth deep into her bones. She could not see more than a few feet in front of her. The world was a blinding, roaring chaos of white. She kept her head down, following the faint outline of the road by memory. One slow, deliberate step at a time. Her skirt, heavy with snow, dragged at her legs, her lungs burned with every frozen breath. More than once, she stumbled into a drift, the snow sucking at her boots, and had to fight her way back to firmer ground. She was terrified, but the image of the children's faces pulled her forward. A beacon in the blizzard. It felt like an eternity, but finally she saw it. A faint flickering yellow light nearly obscured by the driving snow. The cabin relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She staggered the last few yards, her body numb and aching, and collapsed against the rough wood of the door, fumbling for the latch with frozen fingers. The door swung inward, and she stumbled into the room, bringing a swirl of snow and ice with her. The scene that met her eyes stole the last of her breath. The cabin was freezing, the air thick with a damp, chilling cold. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to a handful of sullen, glowing embers, offering no heat at all. Luke and Annie were huddled together under a single thin blanket on the floor, their faces pale and pinched, their eyes enormous with fear, and slumped in the chair beside the hearth was Eli. His head was lulled to one side, his face flushed with an unnatural, feverish heat. A violent tremor racked his body, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. He was soaked through, his clothes stiff with melting snow. He must have been caught outside when the storm hit, trying to secure the animals. With his ribs still healing, the exposure had been too much. Clara's exhaustion and fear were burned away by a surge of pure adrenaline. She slammed the door shut against the howling wind and rushed to the children. "It is all right," she said, her voice a little shaky but firm. "I am here now. Everything is going to be all right." She stripped off her frozen outer layers and immediately set to work. Her first priority was the fire. She sent Luke to fetch the last of the split logs from the woodbox, her calm instructions cutting through his fear. She knelt at the hearth, her hands deft and sure, adding kindling and coaxing the dying embers back to life. As flames finally licked up the dry wood, a wave of warmth began to push back the oppressive cold. Next, she turned her attention to Eli. "Luke, help me," she commanded. Together, they managed to half-drag, half-carry his dead weight to the bed in the corner. He was muttering incoherently, his skin burning to the touch. Clara sent Annie to fetch water and rags. She gently cut away his wet clothes, her movements efficient and devoid of any modesty. She saw the tight binding around his ribs in the dark, ugly bruises that still shadowed his skin. She bathed his face and chest with cool water. Trying to bring the fever down, she heated the beef broth she had brought and spoon-fed some to the children, their first real food of the day. They ate ravenously, their eyes never leaving her face, as if she were an angel who had appeared out of the storm. Once they were fed, she tucked them into their loft bed, piling every spare blanket on top of them. "You sleep now," she whispered, stroking Annie's hair. "I will watch over your uncle." And so began the long vigil. The blizzard raged outside, a constant roaring reminder of their isolation. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and Eli's fevered, restless muttering. Clara sat in the chair beside his bed, bathing his forehead, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips and listening. In the grip of the fever, the walls Eli had built around his heart crumbled to dust. The words spilled out of him, fragmented and raw, ghosts of a conversation she was not meant to hear. "Should have listened. Stubborn fool," he mumbled, his head thrashing on the pillow. "The money. Always the money. I told you, John. Told you it was a fool's errand." Clara leaned closer, her heart aching for him. He was reliving the argument, the last words he ever spoke to his brother. His voice grew louder, thick with a guilt that was almost tangible in the small cabin. "My fault. I let you go. Let you ride out angry. The horse? It was my anger that spooked him. Not an accident. It was me." His body convulsed with a dry, racking sob. "Me?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She understood now. The weight he carried was not just grief, but a profound, soul-crushing guilt. He believed he was responsible for his brother's death. She reached out and took his hand. It was hot and dry, but he gripped her fingers with surprising strength, as if he were a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. "Shoot, Eli," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm in the fever-adult darkness. "It is all right. You are not alone. I am here." She did not know if he heard her, but his thrashing seemed to quiet. She sat there for hours, holding his hand, murmuring soft words of comfort whenever his nightmares threatened to consume him. The fire burned low. The shadows danced on the walls, and the storm howled its endless lament. She held on, a solitary guardian, until the first weak hint of dawn grayed the frosted window panes, utterly exhausted. Her head finally drooped, and she fell into a shallow, fitful sleep in the chair, her hands still clutching his. Eli woke to the strange sensation of sunlight on his eyelids. It was a pale, watery light, but it was light nonetheless. His mind felt clear, the feverish fog having lifted, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache. The storm had quieted to a low, mournful whistle. He turned his head, a sharp pain in his ribs, reminding him of his foolishness, and saw her. Clara was asleep in the chair, pulled close to his bed. Her head was tilted at an awkward angle, her face softened by sleep and exhaustion. A stray lock of brown hair had fallen across her cheek. The morning light filtering through the intricate frost patterns on the window illuminated her, casting her in a gentle, ethereal glow. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the lines of fatigue around her mouth. She had fought a battle for him last night, for him, and for the children. He lay there for a long time, just looking at her in the quiet morning light, stripped of her usual composure. He saw not just the capable schoolteacher or the kind visitor. He saw a woman of incredible strength and profound compassion. She had walked through a blizzard for them. She had nursed him, a man who had offered her little more than gruff tolerance, and she had calmed his demons in the dark. A feeling he could not name, warm and unfamiliar, stirred in his chest. It was gratitude, but it was something more, something deeper, and it frightened him. The blizzard had buried them. For 3 days, the world beyond the cabin ceased to exist. They were marooned on a small wooden island in a vast white sea. The enforced isolation should have been tense and awkward, but instead a strange and fragile peace settled over the small home. The storm had stripped away all pretense, leaving them with the simple raw reality of survival. They fell into an easy rhythm. Eli, still weak and nursing his bruised ribs, was confined to the cabin. He spent his time mending harnesses and sharpening tools by the fire, his hands needing to be busy. Clara took over the running of the house with a quiet efficiency that amazed him. She made their meager rations stretch into warm, savory meals. She kept the fire roaring, its warmth a constant, cheerful presence, and she brought the cabin to life. She taught the children games they could play with pebbles and string. She read to them from the one book of stories she had brought with her, her voice rising and falling with a tale, holding them all spellbound. For the first time, Eli saw his nephew laugh until tears streamed down his face. He watched as Annie, who had barely spoken a word in months, chattered away to Clara, showing her a small doll made of corn husks. In the long evenings after the children were asleep in the loft, Eli and Clara would sit by the fire. The silence between them was no longer heavy and strained, but comfortable, companionable. They started to talk. He told her about growing up on this land, about his father, a man as hard and unyielding as the Wyoming winters. He spoke of his brother, not of his death, but of his life, of John's reckless grin, his wild dreams, his fierce, protective love for his family. In turn, Clara spoke of her life back east, of her love for books and learning, of her gentle, scholarly husband, whose hands had been stained with ink instead of dirt. One night, as the fire popped and hissed, she looked into the flames, her expression wistful. "After Thomas died," she said softly, "the whole town looked at me with such pity. The women would stop talking when I entered a room. They would whisper behind their hands. Some of them even said I was cursed, that I had brought bad luck upon my husband by being I do not know, too healthy, perhaps too alive." She gave a small, humorless laugh, as if I had stolen his breath from myself. Eli looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a pain that mirrored his own. Cursed. It was the same word the gossips in Prairie Creek used for him. They were two sides of the same coin, branded by loss, judged by a world that did not understand their grief. He felt a sudden, powerful urge to reach out, to bridge the small distance between them. Slowly, hesitantly, He extended his hand and gently touched hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. Her hand was warm, and she did not pull away. She simply turned her palm upward and laced her fingers through his. It was a simple gesture, but for Eli, it was a seismic shift. For the first time in years, he was not alone in his sorrow. They sat there in silence for a long time, their hands intertwined, the firelight flickering on their faces, the sleeping children breathing softly in a loft above. A fragile, unspoken understanding passed between them, a bond forged in the heart of the storm. On the fourth day, the world returned. A neighbor from a nearby ranch, Josiah Bell, managed to break a trail through the drifts. He knocked on the door, his face red from the cold, expecting to find the Carters in dire straits. Instead, he found a warm, tidy cabin, 2 smiling children, and Clara Bennett pouring Eli a cup of coffee. Josiah's eyes widened, taking in the scene. He saw the comfortable domesticity, the way Clara moved about the kitchen as if she belonged there, the way Eli watched her. He was not a malicious man, but he was a gossip, and the story was too good not to tell. He accepted a cup of coffee, made some awkward small talk about the storm, and left as quickly as he could, his mind already composing the tale he would tell in town. The news hit Prairie Creek like a second blizzard. Clara Bennett had not just visited the Carter Ranch. She had been snowed in with him. For 3 days and 3 nights alone, the whispers turned into a roar. The women who had called her the Cowboys Charity Project now had a much harsher name for her. She had spent nights alone with a man. The judgment was swift and merciless. Clara felt that the next time she went to the general store, the silence that fell upon her entry was absolute, a cold, heavy blanket of condemnation. Martha Beasley turned her back on her completely. Miss Gable looked her up and down with a sneer that made Clara's cheeks burn with shame. She knew what they were thinking. She knew the ugly words they were whispering. A part of her felt a hot, sickening shame, not for herself, but for the children. She did not want their names or their uncles dragged through the mud because of her. But another stronger part of her rebelled. She had saved that family. She had nursed a sick man and fed 2 hungry children. She would not apologize for her compassion. She bought her supplies, her chin held high, and walked out of the store without giving them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Eli heard the talk, too. He rode into town for grain and was met with sly winks and sniggering comments from the men loafing outside the saloon. He ignored them, his jaw tight, his face a mask of stone. But when he saw Josiah Bell holding court inside, recounting a much embellished version of his visit to the ranch, something inside Eli snapped. The simmering anger he had kept banked for so long erupted into a raging fire. He strode into the saloon, the swinging doors banging against the walls. The room fell silent. He walked straight up to Josiah. "You have something to say about my affairs." "Bell." Eli's voice was dangerously quiet. "Say it to my face." Josiah flustered, stammered. "Now, Eli, I was just telling the boys." "You were running your mouth." Eli cut him off. "You were dragging a good woman's name through the dirt. A woman who kept my family from starving while you were sitting warm by your fire." One of the banker's sons, a smug young man named Thomas Gable, laughed. "She keep you warm, too, Carter." Eli moved so fast no one saw it coming. He grabbed Gable by the front of his shirt and slammed him against the bar. Glasses rattled. Men scrambled to get out of the way. "You will take that back," Eli snarled, his face inches from Gable's. Gable, a coward at heart, palled, but his friends surged forward, and for a moment, the saloon devolved into a chaotic mess of shoving and shouting. The bartender, a burly man named Silas, waded in with a sawed-off shotgun. "That is enough. Take it outside, Eli." His rage, spent as quickly as it had come, released Gable with a shove. He gave the room one last contemptuous glare and strode out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He rode home, the cold wind doing little to cool the fury still burning in his veins. He arrived back at the cabin as dusk was falling. Clara was on the porch, waiting for him. She must have seen him ride in. She saw the fresh cut on his cheekbone and the dark bruise forming around his eye where a stray fist had caught him. She saw the raw, silent anger in his posture. He dismounted and walked past her without a word, heading into the barn to tend to his horse. A moment later, she followed him in, carrying a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. The barn was filled with the scent of hay and horses, and the fading light of day slanted through the cracks in the walls. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders slumped. He had not won anything. He had only made things worse. He had behaved like the wild animal they all thought he was. He felt her presence behind him, and he braced himself for her questions, for her disappointment. But she did not speak. She simply came to his side, dipped the cloth in the warm water, and gently began to clean the cut on his face. Her touch was soft, her movements sure. He stood perfectly still, his fists clenched, his throat tight, with 1,000 unspoken words. He had fought for her. It was a clumsy, violent, foolish gesture, but he had done it. He had defended her honor. She finished cleaning the cut, her fingers lingering for a second on his cheek. He turned his head and looked at her. Her eyes, in the gathering gloom of the barn, were dark and full of an emotion he could not read. It was not pity. It was not anger. It was something deeper, something that mirrored the fierce, unresolved turmoil in his own soul. Neither of them spoke a word. They did not need to. The air between them crackled with the things they could not say. A current of emotion so powerful, so raw and undeniable, it burned in the quiet twilight. Spring arrived in Wyoming not as a gentle guest, but as a muddy, brawling mess. The great mountains of snow melted into rushing torrents, turning the hard-packed earth into a treacherous sea of mud. The creek behind the ranch swelled its banks, its water brown and churning. Green shoots, stubborn and fierce, pushed their way through the cold ground. The air, for the first time in months, held the promise of warmth, a damp, earthy scent of life returning. But the new season brought no relief to the Carter Ranch. It only laid bare the stark reality of their situation. The threat of foreclosure, which had been a distant wolf howling in the winter wind, was now at the door. Mr. Gable's deadline loomed, as certain as the rising sun. Eli felt the weight of it in every waking moment. He worked from dawn until dusk, his body aching, his mind a constant turmoil of numbers that would not add up. The winter had been hard on their meager supplies. The spring planting required seed he could not afford to buy. The ranch was bleeding out, and he did not know how to stop it. He made a decision in the dead of night, a choice born of quiet desperation. He would sell the last dozen head of cattle. They were thin from the winter, and he would not get a good price for them. But it would be enough. Enough to pay off the most pressing debts, enough to satisfy Gable for another month or two, enough to buy a little more time. He did not tell Clara. He did not tell the children. He kept the plan locked away in the silent, stony prison of his own heart. He knew what it meant. A ranch without cattle was not a ranch at all. It was just a slow death. It was surrender. But his pride would not let him admit that, especially not to the woman who had come to mean more to him than he dared to acknowledge. Clara, however, was not blind. She saw the new lines of strain around his eyes, the way he moved with the grim determination of a man walking to the gallows. She knew their supplies were low, and she knew the banker was a patient predator. Her chance to learn the truth came during a trip into town. As she was leaving the general store, she saw Mr. Gable exiting the bank on an impulse. She crossed the muddy street to speak with him. "Mr. Gable," she began, her voice polite but firm. "I wish to inquire about the Carter Ranch." The banker looked down his nose at her, a small dismissive smile playing on his lips. "Miss Bennett, I am not at liberty to discuss the financial affairs of my clients. Mr. Carter is more than a client." She pressed on, ignoring the snub. "His children are my pupils. Their welfare is my concern." Gable's smile widened. "Then you should be pleased. Mr. Carter has finally seen reason. He is making arrangements to sell off his remaining stock to a buyer I have found. It will not be enough to save the ranch, of course, but it will settle a portion of his debt. A sensible, if overdue, decision." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. He was selling the cattle, giving up. A cold fury, sharp and clean, rose in her chest. It was not just the act itself, but the secrecy. He had not trusted her. He had decided to let their shared dream die without even a fight. She gave the banker a curt nod, turned on her heel, and marched back toward the ranch, her skirt splattered with mud, her heart pounding with a righteous anger. She found Eli in the barn repairing a piece of harness. He looked up as she entered, his expression wary. He saw the storm in her eyes. "You are selling the cattle," she said. It was not a question. He stiffened, putting down his tools with deliberate slowness. "It is my business." "Your business?" She shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. "This ranch, these children, this life we have been trying to build. You think that is just your business? You're giving up, Eli. After everything we have been through, you're just going to roll over and let that man in town win." His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "You know nothing about it. You stand here in my barn on my land, and you presume to tell me how to handle my own failure. It is not your failure," she cried, taking a step closer. "It is a hardship, a struggle. It is something we're meant to face together. But you will not let me in. You would rather let this place crumble to dust than accept a helping hand. A helping hand, he exploded, his voice echoing in the cavernous barn. The carefully controlled anger he had held in for so long finally broke its leash. You think your loaves of bread and your storybooks can stop the bank from taking my home. You are from the East. You do not understand what it is like to lose everything. To watch the land your father broke his back on turn to sand in your hands. To bury your own brother and know you are all that is left to fail. The words, full of a pain so deep and raw it silenced her, hung in the air between them. Tears streamed down Clara's face, hot and bitter. You are a fool, Eli Carter, she whispered, her voice choked with sorrow. You are so blinded by what you have lost that you cannot see what you still have. You have Luke. You have Annie. You have a chance right here to build something new. But you're too proud and too stubborn to see it. From the shadows near the open barn door, a small figure moved. It was Annie. She had been playing in the yard and had heard the shouting. She stood there, her small face pale, her eyes wide with terror, looking from her uncle's enraged face to Clara's tear-streaked one. The two pillars of her fragile world were shaking, and it was too much to bear. A small wounded sound escaped her lips, and then she turned and ran, not toward the house, but toward the open plains, toward the rolling hills that rose up behind the ranch. Annie, Clara screamed. The anger vanished from Eli's face, replaced by a stark, cold panic. Annie, he roared, his voice cracking. They both bolted from the barn, their argument forgotten. Their shared world narrowed to a single, terrifying focus, the small, retreating figure of a frightened little girl. Panic was a cold, sharp thing. It drove them forward through the sucking mud of the corral, over the new spring grass, and up into the hills. The sun began to set, painting the sky in cruel, beautiful shades of orange and purple. The air grew cold, the wind picking up, a reminder that spring nights in Wyoming were still winter's kin. They called her name until their throats were raw. The sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Eli's mind was a maelstrom of guilt and terror. The image of Annie's frightened face was burned into his thoughts. He had done this. His anger, his pride had terrified her. If anything happened to her, he could not complete the thought. It was a darkness too profound to contemplate. He ran beside Clara, their earlier conflict dissolved by a shared, desperate purpose. They were no longer two separate people, but a single entity, a single prayer sent out into the growing darkness. Hours passed. The moon rose. A sliver of silver in a black star-dusted sky. The cold was biting now, and a new fear joined the old one. The cold. The creek swollen with meltwater. The predators that roamed the hills at night. They searched frantically, their lanterns cutting small, feeble circles in the immense darkness. It was Eli who found her. He heard a faint sound, a small whimpering cry carried on the wind from the direction of the creek. He plunged down the steep, slippery bank, Clara right behind him. And there she was. Annie was huddled on a small patch of ground, her back against a large boulder. The creek, swollen and raging with spring melt, had cut her off, the water swirling just a few feet from where she sat. She was soaked, her dress clinging to her small, shivering frame. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears. Annie, Eli breathed, his voice breaking. She looked up, her eyes wide and dazed with fear and cold. Uncle Eli, she whispered. He did not hesitate. He waded into the churning, ice-cold water, the current pulling at his legs. It only came up to his knees, but its power was immense. He reached her, scooped her up into his arms, and held her tight against his chest. She was so cold, so small. He could feel the violent tremors running through her body. He turned and carried her back through the water, his boots filling, his legs numb, his only thought to get her back, to get her warm. When he reached the bank where Clara was waiting, his own control finally shattered. He sank to his knees in the mud, clutching the shivering child and the tears he had held back for months, for years. Finally came. Great. Racking sobs tore through him. Tears of terror, of relief, of a love so fierce it was an agony. He buried his face in Annie's damp hair and wept. Clara knelt beside them, her hands on them both, her own tears falling silently in the moonlight. They carried her back to the cabin, a silent, shaken procession. They stripped off her wet clothes and wrapped her in warm blankets. Placing her in front of the roaring fire Clara had quickly built. Luke, who had been waiting by the door, his face a mask of stoic fear, watched them with wide, silent eyes. Eli chafed Annie's hands and feet, his movements desperate, willing his own warmth into her. Clara forced sips of warm, sweetened milk between her lips. Slowly, the shivering subsided. The color returned to her cheeks, and her eyes, heavy with exhaustion, finally drifted shut. She was safe. With the children finally asleep, a profound and heavy silence fell over the cabin. Eli and Clara stood by the hearth, two statues carved from exhaustion and relief. The events of the day, the argument, the fear, the desperate search had stripped them bare, leaving their emotions raw and exposed. Eli turned to her, his face haggard in the firelight. "Clara, he began, his voice rough. She stopped him, placing a finger on his lips. She did not need apologies. She understood. She stepped forward into the space between them and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. For a moment, he stood rigid and used to such comfort, such closeness. Then, with a shuddering breath, he let go. His arms came around her, pulling her tight, his hands tangling in her hair. He held on, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just tried to spin apart. It was not a kiss. It was something more fundamental. It was two broken people holding the pieces of their shattered world together. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, they stood there holding on, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They were in this together. They were a family. That morning, something shifted in Clara. The quiet, resilient school teacher became a quiet, ferocious general. She would not let this family fail. She took the small amount of money she had saved and bought a large store of flour and sugar. And then she began to bake. Her small room in town became a whirlwind of activity. Loaves of bread, cakes, pies. She traded her baked goods with the other ranchers' wives for things the Carters needed. Jars of preserves, smoked meats, seed potatoes, a few laying hens. She started a small school in the Carters' barn for the handful of children from the outlying ranches, whose parents were tired of the town's judgmental attitudes. In return for her lessons, the families paid her not in coin, but in goods and labor. One man came and repaired the section of roof that had been leaking. Another helped Eli plow a new field. Her actions sent ripples through Prairie Creek. Some people were moved by her unwavering determination. A few of the women, quietly and away from the disapproving eyes of Martha Beasley's circle, began to help, dropping off a basket of eggs or a few skis of wool. They saw not a scandalous woman, but a good one, fighting for a family she had come to love. But for every person whose heart softened, another's hardened. The gossip grew more vicious, fueled by jealousy and spite. "She is just trying to trap him," Mrs. Gable said over tea, playing the martyr. "She knows that land will be worth something one day. She is seducing the cowboy for his land. Plain and simple." The words were poison meant to isolate her, to shame her into giving up. And one evening, they found their mark. Eli came in from the fields, tired and sore, but with a feeling of hope he had not known in years. The new field was planted. The pantry was no longer bare. He looked for Clara in the cabin, but did not find her. He found her in the barn, sitting on a hay bale in the fading light, her face buried in her hands. He heard the small, choked sounds of her crying. He came to her side, his heart aching. "Clara, what is it?" She looked up, her face stained with tears, her eyes full of a deep, weary hurt. "I was in town," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Martha Beasley. She saw me trading a pie for some cloth. She said it out loud for everyone to hear. She said I was a shameless woman bartering my way into a man's bed." Her composure broke, and a fresh wave of sobs shook her. "I'm so tired of their whispers. Eli, I am so tired of their hate. I only wanted to help." Eli knelt in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his. He looked into her eyes, his own gaze fierce and full of a profound certainty. "Do not listen to them," he said, his voice low and intense. "They are small, bitter people, and they do not matter." He lifted a calloused thumb and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "You came here with nothing but a loaf of bread and a kind heart. You faced down a blizzard. You fought for my children. You brought this place back from the dead." He paused, his throat tight. "You have done more for this place and for me than any man ever did." His words, simple and true, were everything she needed to hear. She looked at him, at his earnest, weathered face, and saw not just gratitude, but a deep and abiding respect. She saw love. The air in the barn grew thick, charged with all the unspoken feelings that had been building between them for months. He was still kneeling, his hands holding hers. He leaned forward slowly, hesitantly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. She met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a fiery explosion, but a quiet, trembling discovery. It was hesitant, gentle, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt from her tears and of a longing so deep it was almost painful. It was filled with the fear of what this meant, but it was also filled with the undeniable, breathtaking hope of a new beginning. They broke apart, both trembling, their foreheads resting against each other. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the dusty, quiet twilight of the barn. He was about to speak, to try and find the words for the monumental thing that had just happened, when the sound of a hoarse and a gruff voice calling his name from the yard shattered the moment. "Eli! Eli Carter, you in there?" Eli frowned, pulling back from Clara. The voice was familiar, but one he had not heard in years. They walked to the barn door and looked out. A stout, bearded man was dismounting from a tired-looking horse. Eli recognized him instantly. "Jedediah," Eli said, his voice flat. "Jedediah Wells, what are you doing here?" Jedediah had been John's closest friend, a partner in more than one of his reckless schemes. He was a drifter and hard drinker, a man Eli had never much liked or trusted. Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Heard you were still kicking out here," he said, his eyes shifting from Eli to Clara and back again, a sly look on his face. He walked closer, lowering his voice. "I was down in Laramie, heard some talk about your brother, John, about that day he died." He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, for an accident, it sure seems like a lot of folks knew that saddle of his was tampered with." The moment before Jedediah Wells spoke had been one of fragile, trembling hope. The moment after, the world fractured. The warmth of Clara's kiss turned to ash in Eli's mouth. He pulled away from her, turning his full attention to the stout, unkempt man who smelled of stale whiskey and the open road. "What are you talking about, Jedediah?" Eli's voice was low, a dangerous rumble. "John's death was an accident." Jedediah shrugged, pulling a twist of tobacco from his pocket and biting off a piece. "That is the official story." "Sure, but your brother, well, you know how he was. Full of big plans and short on cash. He owed money to some hard men, and he was a fool when he drank." He spat a brown stream near the barn wall. "I was with him at the saloon in Laram the day before. He was drunk, boasting about some new claim he was about to stake, waving a map around. He got into it with a couple card sharps. Ugly words were said. Eli's blood ran cold. He remembered John's excitement, the wild look in his eyes. He had dismissed it as another one of John's foolish dreams. "And the saddle," Eli pressed, his hands clenched into fists. "The cinch looked fine to the eye," Jedediah said, warming to his story. "But a man I know, a fellow who saw the horse after it was brought in. He said the leather had been sliced halfway through, just enough so that a hard ride, a sudden gallop, it would give way. Your brother was a reckless rider when he was drunk, but he was not a fool. That saddle was tampered with." Jedediah's words were poison, seeping into the wound of Eli's guilt and turning it septic. The simple heavy burden of his anger causing an accident was one thing. This was another. This was darker. A tangled knot of suspicion, betrayal, and murder. Who were the men? Why John owed the money? The questions swarmed in his mind, a cloud of angry hornets, and in the center of it all was the same throbbing ache. He had let his brother ride out alone and angry to face a danger he knew nothing about. Clara watched, her heart sinking as the man she had just kissed disappeared before her eyes. The warmth in his face was gone, replaced by the old familiar mask of stone and shadow. He had retreated to that dark, lonely place inside himself, and this time she feared he would never find his way out. Jedediah stayed for a meal, which he ate greedily, and then, with a promise to ask around some more. He rode off, leaving a trail of chaos in his wake. In the days that followed, Eli was a ghost. He moved through his chores with a grim mechanical efficiency, but his eyes were distant, lost in the past. He barely spoke to the children, and when he looked at Clara, it was as if he were looking straight through her. The fragile intimacy they had built, the kiss that had promised a future, was buried under a fresh landslide of guilt. One evening, she found him by the graves behind the barn, staring at the wooden crosses as the sun set. "Eli, please," she said, her voice soft. "Do not do this. That man, Jedediah, he is not a reliable source. You cannot let his words destroy what we have built." He did not turn to look at her. "It does not matter if he is reliable," he said, his voice flat and lifeless. "John is dead, and I was not there for him. Maybe I could have stopped him. Maybe if our last words had not been spoken in anger, he would have listened to me. This is my penance. To carry this penance, she cried, her frustration boiling over. By shutting us out, by letting the past poison the present? What about the children? Eli, what about me? Do we not deserve more from you than this obsession with a past you cannot change? He finally turned to her, and the look in his eyes was one of profound, bottomless despair. You do not understand. I deserve this pain. I failed him. It is only right that I should be punished. She saw then that she could not reach him. He had locked himself in a prison of his own, making and thrown away the key. He believed he was unworthy of happiness, of love, of the very family he had fought so hard to protect. She walked back to the cabin defeated, a cold dread seeping into her heart. The town, it seemed, was determined to prove Eli right. The whispers about Clara had not died down. They had merely been waiting for new fuel. They found it one morning when she arrived at the one-room schoolhouse. The words were scrolled across the freshly painted door in thick black tar, crude and ugly. Sinful woman, go back east. Clara stared at the words, her stomach turning to ice. This was not just gossip anymore. This was a violation. They had defaced her school, the one place in this town where she felt she belonged, where she was doing good. Children were already arriving, their parents pulling them back, pointing and whispering. She saw Martha Beasley and Mrs. Gable standing across the street, their faces alight with smug, vindictive satisfaction. Humiliation hot and sharp washed over her. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear, but she thought of Luke and Annie, of the other children who counted on her. She took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and began the day's lessons as if her heart were not breaking. News of the vandalism reached the ranch by midday. A sympathetic rancher, one whose son attended Clara's barn school, rode out to tell Eli. As Eli listened, his face grew dark, but it was not the unfocused, brooding anger of the past few days. It was a cold, sharp, focused rage. He knew who was responsible. He knew it with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. Thomas Gable, the banker's arrogant son. Without a word, he strode to the barn, saddled his horse, and rode toward town, his back straight, his jaw set like granite. Clara saw him go, and a new fear seized her. She knew where he was going and what he intended to do. Eli did not go to the saloon this time. He rode straight to the bank. He dismounted, tied his horse to the hitching post, and walked inside. The bank was quiet, filled with the scent of money and floor wax. Mr. Gable sat behind his desk. His son Thomas was at a smaller desk nearby, pretending to look over a ledger. Gable, Eli said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of steel. Thomas looked up, and the color drained from his face. Carter, the elder Gable said, his voice cool and dismissive. If you're here about your loan, I am here about my son, Eli said, his eyes locked on Thomas. He owes the school teacher an apology, and he's going to give it to her publicly. Thomas let out a nervous, sneering laugh. I do not know what you are talking about. Eli took 2 slow steps toward the younger man's desk. You are a coward and a liar. You defaced the schoolhouse because you were too afraid to face a man you had wronged. Now you'll clean the tar off that door, and you will apologize to Miss Bennett in front of the entire town, or you will deal with me. Mr. Gable rose to his feet, his face purple with rage. You dare to come into my bank and threaten my son. You are a broke, pathetic rancher. Carter, get out before I have the sheriff remove you. Eli did not even glance at him. He kept his eyes on Thomas, who was now trembling. This is not about money, Gable. This is about honor, something you and your boy clearly know nothing about. He turned and walked out of the bank, leaving a stunned, furious silence behind him. He did not need to make a scene. He had planted a seed of fear, and he knew it would bear fruit. He was right. An hour later, a humiliated Thomas Gable was seen in front of the schoolhouse with a bucket and rags, scrubbing at the tar under the watchful, triumphant eyes of half the town. He mumbled a barely audible apology to Clara, who accepted it with quiet dignity. The victory, however, was short-lived. The next morning, the sheriff rode out to the ranch. He carried a letter from Mr. Gable. The banker was retaliating. He was calling in the entirety of the loan effective immediately. He gave them 1 week to pay the full amount or the foreclosure proceedings would begin. They would be evicted. It was over. The ranch was lost. That night, Clara sat in the quiet cabin, watching the 2 children sleep in the loft. Eli was outside, walking the boundaries of the land he was about to lose. A silent, solitary vigil. The weight of it all finally crushed her. She was the cause of this. Her presence, her compassion, her love. It had all brought nothing but ruin upon them. The town hated her because of her. Eli had made a powerful enemy. Because of her, this family was about to lose their home. If she were gone, perhaps Gable would relent. If she were gone, Eli would be free of the scandal she had brought upon him. The thought was an agony, a knife twisting in her heart, but the logic seemed inescapable. To save them, she had to leave them. With trembling hands, she lit a lamp and sat down at the rough-hewn table. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. My dearest Eli, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please do not try to follow me. It is better this way. I came to this place seeking peace, and instead I have brought you nothing but trouble. I have seen the way the town looks at you because of me. I have brought the wrath of a powerful man down upon your home. I cannot bear to be the cause of any more pain for you or for the children you love so dearly. Know this, the time I have spent here in this small cabin has been the happiest of my life. You have shown me what true strength and courage are. You have allowed me into your heart, and I will cherish that gift forever. I love you, Eli. I love you more than I have words to say. And I love Luke and Annie as if they were my own. That is why I must go, perhaps without me here. Mr. Gable will show some mercy. Perhaps you can still save this place. I cannot ruin your life by staying. Please tell the children I will never forget them. And please do not let the past consume you. You have so much good in you. You have so much life left to live. Live it. Be happy. That is all I ask. Yours always, Clara. She folded the letter, her tears staining the paper. She packed a small bag with her few belongings. She crept up to the loft and kissed each of the sleeping children on the forehead, her heart breaking with every silent step. Then she slipped out into the darkness. She did not take a horse. She would walk to town and catch the first morning stagecoach heading east. It did not matter where it was going. Anywhere was better than here. Eli returned to the cabin near midnight, his soul as empty as the night sky. He saw the letter on the table immediately. The sight of it filled him with a sudden, inexplicable dread. He tore it open. As he read her words, the fog of guilt and suspicion that had clouded his mind for days was blasted away by a clean, sharp agony. She was gone while he had been communing with ghosts. The most vital living part of his world had walked away. He had been so obsessed with the past, with a debt he could never repay to his brother, that he had failed to see the incredible gift he had been given in the present. He had let her believe she was the cause of his ruin, when in truth she had been his salvation. A storm was rolling in, the same as the night he had almost lost Annie. The wind was rising, and he could hear the distant rumble of thunder. He did not hesitate. He ran to the barn, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He threw the saddle on his horse, his hands sure and swift. He would not let her go. He rode out into the stormy night, the wind whipping at his face, the first fat drops of rain beginning to fall. He urged his horse on, his mind singularly focused. He had to find her. The road to town was a river of mud, the rain coming down in sheets, turning the world into a blur of gray and black. He found her a mile down the road. Or rather, he found the broken-down wagon of a farmer who had foolishly tried to make it to town ahead of the storm. One of its wheels was shattered, stuck deep in the mud, and huddled under the inadequate shelter of its canvas cover, shivering and soaked, was Clara. She must have accepted a ride from the farmer, who had likely gone for help. She was crying, her face buried in her shawl, a small, desolate figure in the raging storm. He dismounted and strode through the mud and driving rain toward her. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Eli. He reached the wagon and stood before her, the rain plastering his hair to his head, streaming down his face. He looked at her, at the woman he loved, the woman he had almost lost through his own blind foolishness. All the confusion, all the guilt, all the ghosts of the past fell away, leaving only one simple, undeniable truth. He reached out and took her cold, trembling hand, and his voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong over the roar of the storm. I lost my brother once because I stayed silent, he said, his grip tightening on her hand. I will not lose you the same way. The words were a promise, an absolution, a declaration. He pulled her gently from under the canvas, out into the pouring rain. She came into his arms without hesitation, her hands clutching the front of his wet shirt. They embraced a raw, desperate reunion in the heart of the storm. The rain poured down on them, washing away the tears, the pain, the fear. It was a baptism, a new beginning. He held her face in his hands and kissed her, a kiss not of hesitant discovery, but of fierce, certain, claiming love. He lifted her onto his horse and swung up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, shielding her from the wind. He turned the horse around and rode back toward the ranch, back toward home. They arrived as the storm was beginning to break, the first hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. Luke and Annie were awake, their frightened faces peering out the cabin door. They had woken to find both Eli and Clara gone. Eli dismounted and lifted a soaked and shivering Clara down. He kept one arm firmly around her as they walked toward the cabin, toward the children. He stopped in front of them, his gaze meeting Luke's, then Annie's. He looked down at the woman standing by his side, her head resting against his shoulder, and his voice was clear and steady for all to hear. "This is your home," he said, looking at Clara, then back at the children. "This is our home, if you will still have me." Eli's declaration, made in the gray light of a stormy dawn, was not a magic spell. It did not erase their debts or silence the town's venomous tongues. It was something quieter and far more powerful. It was the driving of a stake into the ground, a claiming of a piece of the world, not by deed or by title, but by the sheer stubborn force of love. "This," it said, "is our home, and we will not be moved." The months that followed were a testament to that resolve. Summer came, hot and dry, baking the mud into hardpan and turning the plains a dusty gold. Every day was a battle, but now it was a battle they fought together. Eli rose with the sun, his movements no longer driven by the grim specter of failure, but by a steady, quiet purpose. He worked the land with a renewed vigor, his focus on the furrows in the earth, not the ghosts at his back. The story Jedediah Wells had brought with him, a story of murder and betrayal, began to lose its power. Eli thought of the man, of his shifty eyes and the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. He was a drifter, a teller of tales for a free meal, the truth of his brother's death. Eli decided one hot afternoon while mending a fence was buried with him. Chasing after it would be like chasing the wind. His duty was not to the dead, but to the living, to the woman who worked beside him and the children who depended on him. He let the past go. Clara was his shadow, his partner in all things. She learned to milk the cow, to mend the harnesses, to see the signs of a coming storm in the clouds. Her hands, once soft and suited to chalk dust and books, grew calloused and capable. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. Their shared labor a language more profound than words. The banker's threat did not simply vanish. Mr. Gable was a man who did not forgive a slight, but the small community Clara had fostered became their shield. The ranchers, whose children she taught, made sure the Carters never wanted for meat or grain. When the first payment on the restructured loan came due, they had the money. It was a meager amount, scraped together from the bartering of Clara's lessons and the sale of a few calves from a bull, gifted to them by a sympathetic neighbor. Eli walked into the bank, his head held high, and placed the money on Gable's desk. It was not a victory, but it was a reprieve. It was a message. We are still here. We are not broken. Their love deepened in the crucible of that long, hard summer. It was not a love of breathless poetry or grand gestures. It was a quiet, steadfast thing born of survival and forged in mutual respect. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of water in the field without her having to ask, his eyes gentle as he watched her drink. It was in the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him at the end of a long day, her hand resting on his shoulder for a moment as she passed. It was in the comfortable silences that fell between them in the evenings, a shared peace that needed no words. They were two wounded souls who had found not a cure in each other, but a companion with whom to bear the scars. They learned to read the landscape of each other's moods, to anticipate the needs, to soothe the fears. They were, in the truest sense of the word, partners. The judgment of the town did not disappear. When they rode into Prairie Creek for supplies, they still faced a wall of cold shoulders and hostile glares from Mrs. Gable and her circle. The whispers still followed them, like burrs clinging to a saddle blanket. But something fundamental had changed. The words no longer had the power to wound. Eli and Clara would walk down the main street, a united front, Clara's arm tucked into Eli's, the two children walking between them. They did not bow their heads or hurry past. They met the stairs with a quiet dignity that was its own form of defiance. One afternoon, Martha Beasley saw them coming out of the general store, Luke proudly carrying a new school slate. Well, she sniffed to her companion loud enough for them to hear. Some people have no shame at all. Clara, who months ago would have flushed with humiliation, simply smiled. Just then, Annie, who was holding her hand, saw a stray kitten and let out a peal of delighted laughter. A sound as bright and clear as a bell. The sound of that pure, uncomplicated joy seemed to suck the venom from the air. It made the woman's bitter words sound petty and small. Eli looked down at Clara, and she looked up at him, a shared secret smile passing between them. They had their own world now, their own music, and the laughter of their family was beginning to drown out the whispers. The barn became the heart of their new life. What had once been a place of Eli's solitary labor was transformed. He cleared out one end, built rough-hewn benches and a sturdy teacher's desk. He whitewashed the walls, and the space was filled with light. It became Clara's schoolhouse, a place of learning and laughter for a dozen children from the surrounding homesteads. It was a place of hope, a testament to the fact that something beautiful and life-affirming could grow even in the harshest of environments. The scent of baking bread, the very thing that had first brought Clara to his door, often wafted from a cabin, a constant, comforting promise. It was the smell of home, of nourishment, of a simple, profound kindness that had taken root and blossomed. She would bring fresh, warm loaves to the schoolhouse for the children, and the act became a symbol of what she had brought to all their lives: comfort, sustenance, and unconditional warmth. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves on the cottonwood trees by the creek were turning a brilliant, fiery yellow, Eli knew it was time. He found Clara in the barn, cleaning the slates after the children had gone home. Luke and Annie were outside, their shouts echoing in the clear air. "Come with me," he said softly. She looked at him, saw the quiet resolve in his eyes, and nodded. He took her hand, and then he called to the children. Together the four of them walked up the small rise behind the barn to the place where the wooden crosses stood. The wind was gentle that day, a soft sigh through the dry prairie grass. Eli stood before his brother's grave for a long time, his family around him. Clara stood beside him, her hand in his silent, supportive presence. Annie, not fully understanding, held on to Clara's skirt. Luke stood a little apart, his young face solemn, watching his uncle. This was not the same man who had stood here months ago, a solitary figure drowning in guilt. He was a different man, a man made whole, not by forgetting his loss, but by embracing what he had found. He looked at the weathered wood of the cross, and he finally spoke, his voice low and clear. For his brother and for himself? "John," he said. He squeezed Clara's hand. He looked at the two children, his brother's legacy, his own precious burden. "I did right by them." It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, a promise kept, a peace finally made. He felt the great crushing weight he had carried for so long finally lift from his shoulders, taken away on the autumn wind. He was free. That night, the fire in the hearth crackled and danced, casting a warm, flickering glow across the cabin. The children were asleep, their breathing soft, and even in the loft above. Eli sat in his chair, watching Clara as she mended a tear in Luke's shirt, the needle moving deftly in her skilled fingers. The lamplight caught the warm brown of her hair and the gentle curve of her cheek. He was struck, as he often was, by a wave of profound, overwhelming gratitude. She had not just saved him, she had shown him how to save himself. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet in the peaceful room. She looked up, a small, questioning smile on her lips. "You changed everything," he said, the words coming straight from his heart, simple and unadorned. "I look at this place, at this house. It is the same wood, the same stone, but it is not the same. You brought warmth into a house that had forgotten what it was." She put down her sewing and came to him, kneeling on the rug before his chair. She took his large, calloused hands in her own. Her gaze was soft, full of a deep and patient love. "It was already here, Eli," she answered simply. "The warmth was in you. It was in the children. It was in the memory of the love that built this place. It had just been buried under a lot of pain." She smiled, a radiant, beautiful thing that lit up her whole face. "You just needed to remember." He leaned forward and kissed her. A long, slow kiss full of the quiet promises of 1,000 shared nights to come. It was a kiss of peace, of gratitude, of a future that was no longer a terrifying unknown, but a welcome journey they would take together. The day shortened, and the first hint of winter's chill returned to the wind that swept across the plains. But it no longer held the same threat, the same lonesome howl. It was just the turning of the seasons, the familiar rhythm of a life that was hard. Yes, but also good. The story ends on a day like that. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the vast Wyoming sky in strokes of brilliant orange, deep rose, and soft violet. In the yard in front of the small cabin, two children, their faces bright with joy, were chasing a flock of squawking chickens, their laughter carrying on the crisp evening air. From the open doorway, a woman's own warm laughter joined theirs, a melody of pure contentment. The wind still blew cold across the endless plains, a timeless, untamable force. But inside the small cabin, a fire burned bright in the hearth. And in the hearts of the four souls who called it home, a quiet and resilient love endured. A love that was fragile, hard-won, but as real and enduring as the land itself. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Heart of the Old West channel and share your thoughts in English.